Now what we're going to do is really get down to the nitty-gritty of camera operation. And this is a place that's going to be a little bit difficult for you to catch on right away if you're not familiar with some of these terms. And I would highly suggest, if you want, you're either going to have to roll this back and listen to it several times, or maybe you want to get a piece of paper and a pencil and take some notes on this, because I think once you can get the terminology squared away in your mind and the relationship of how everything works in a camera, it's going to mean so much more to you and make your photography so much better, because then you're going to start thinking in these terms, and that's the difference between a professional and an amateur. So the first thing that we want to talk, you've heard all these terms like f-stop, shutter speed, ISO. What in the world do those all mean? ISO is a standard of measurement set out by the International Standards Committee that says this is what your camera reads as light sensitivity in the camera itself. So in other words, the neat thing about digital cameras is we can set those different ISOs right in the camera. Back in the film days, we weren't able to do that. We had to buy film that was rated for specific ISOs. And some of you people that have the gray hair like me will remember it used to be called ASA, but now it's called ISO. ISO can range from like 100, maybe even 50, but 100 on up to 3,200. I'm even hearing that there's 24,000 now. Now what does all that mean, that ISO? Let's write this down so you don't forget. ISO. And it can range, remember I said, from 50 up to probably, most of it that we see is 4,000, but it can even go up to 24,000. The new cameras are just getting better and better and better on that. So, what this all means is the light sensitivity. Remember, what kind of light is coming into your camera lens? So, if we're in a real bright, sunny day outside, it's going to be a lot of light coming into that camera lens, and it's going to be very sensitive. So then we want to be down around the 100 to 200 setting for bright. Bright light, around 100 to 200 ISO setting. This is ISO now. And your camera will have a place, you read in your manual, and your camera will have a place where it tells you where to set the ISO. Usually it's on the back of the camera, a little button just by itself, and you can set that. Now, as the evening comes on and you're wanting to do stuff in a dimmer light or a cloudy day, you aren't going to get enough light to make a correct exposure into your camera by setting it at 100 or 200 ISO. So then we have to say, we bump it up. We bump it up to maybe 400. And a lot of cameras are presetting 400 as their default menu. So you might want to check that, because it would be way too much light coming in at 400 on a bright sunny day, and then you're going to have overexposed images. So the darker it gets, the higher the number goes. Now, if you're in an area, in a building, in a room where you have to shoot available light and you don't have any flash, then you're going to bump it up even more. Maybe you're going to go up to 1,000 or 1,500 ISO. It all depends on what the conditions are, and you're going to have to kind of read. On your camera, you're going to have to look and see where the meter is reading on that. So that's what ISO means. Hopefully you don't have any questions, because obviously I can't answer them. You'll have to write me an email if you have a question on that. Now, the next thing that's related, so that's the amount of light that can come in. Now, the camera also has other settings that's kind of neat. And if you can imagine the camera as acting like our eyes, it's a good way to imagine this. We're going to be talking about f-stop or aperture. In other words, how big does the lens open up to let light in, an amount of light in? So we all know what an iris of an eye looks like. Remember, our eyes look like this. We have an iris, and then we have a pupil in the middle. And this is our pupil. We'll make that black because that's always black. Well, a camera has the same thing. If we think of a camera lens like this, and we have leaves coming out like this on the shutter, I didn't draw this exactly right, but we'll make a center here for the iris. You'll notice that looks very much like our human eye, and it works like our human eye. So what this is right here is the pupil is called the aperture. I think I spelt that right. And the aperture is how big or how small it's going to be. Now, if we want to keep a lot of bright light from coming into this camera, what are we going to have to do? That's going to have to be really tiny. Remember when you're out in bright light? Shine a light in somebody's eye and look what the pupil does. Squeezes way down. Real tiny because it doesn't want to let a lot of light in. Now, if it's really dark at night and you see cat's eyes, if you look at a cat, you know, and it's dark and they're prowling around, what's their eye look like? They're great big, aren't they? That pupil is big. And that's what's going to happen in the camera. If we are in a dark situation, it's going to have a bigger opening. Lets more light in. Now you need the same amount of light to expose for a good exposure, whether it's bright light or dim light. There's a certain amount of light that you need to expose those cards that we put in there, or our quote film. So this is what's happening. The aperture is the same thing as called the f-stop. You hear a lot of people talking about f-stop, and that's what it is. On your camera there will be a dial for f-stop. It'll say like F, depending upon the lens that you have on your camera, they'll range from 1.2 clear up to 22. So this is, and you'll see an F in front of that, which means f-stop. So F 1.2 to F 22. Different lenses will have different ranges. You get a lens that is down in the 1.2 range, it's going to be a fairly expensive lens, because it's got a lot of glass or a lot of lenses in there to be able to have it see in dark times or dark areas that you might be photographing in. So you'll have different ranges of this. A lot of people like to take on an f-stop and just set their camera at a particular f-stop, and I've talked to one person and he likes to shoot at 7.1. Other people like to shoot at 6.5. Portraitists in the portrait studio, they like to shoot at f8 and various things like that. So wherever your sweet spot is, it all depends. Now, another thing that's going to be related in this that we're going to talk to in a minute is depth of field, and that'll all tie in. So I know there's a lot of information I'm throwing out here at you. Okay, we've talked about the aperture and opening up. Now, what happens is we have a thing called shutter speed, and we have to set that on our camera. So shutter speed is the speed at which these shutters or leaves open and close. In other words, how fast, it'd be like our eye, how fast can our eye close down and open back up again? Because in a camera, these shut down all the way and open up when they take a picture. When they've snapped a picture, it'll be shut. And then when you want to expose it again, it'll open up and shut again. And how fast that is how much light is let in. So you can understand, hopefully now there's a relationship between f-stop and shutter speed. Shutter speeds can range from so many, a tenth of a second, 1 second if it's real slow and it drags in. Let me tell you, a second is a long time when you're waiting for that camera shutter to click. It seems like it's forever. And then there's, you can go up to 500th of a second. It's just unbelievable, and you don't even hear it hardly click. It's just beep, and that's all it is. So that works in relationship to the size and how fast to let in that certain amount of light. Because remember, I said you need just a certain amount of light to expose that file card. So that's what those things are. Let's see what else we have here. In the camera now, you're going to find, especially on your little point and shoot, but even on the professional cameras, there's going to be P for program, A for aperture. So we're going to have all these different things. Let's erase this here so we can get into this. Okay, you're going to have P for program, A for aperture, and then you'll see a TV, and that is shutter speed. And then usually, sometimes they have A for auto. I will tell you that on auto, if you set your camera on auto, you don't have a lot of choices. And unfortunately, the camera doesn't always select the best speeds and apertures and that for you on auto. So I'd say stay away from that. Oh, I just forgot. There's one more. M for manual. Did I spell that right? U-E-L? I don't know. Whatever. Forgive me if I misspelled. Is it an A-L on that, manual? That probably looks a little better. There we go. I'm a photographer. I'm not an English major. So anyway, what do all of these mean? Program is almost like auto. It does a few more things. The camera will do a few more things, but program is just, wow, a lot of people set on that and go. And I've been guilty. I've done it too. It'll just set and away you go, and you don't have a lot of choices. You can kind of turn the dials a little bit, but if you really want to get serious about what I like to do is set mine on aperture priority. And aperture priority means that you the operator sets what aperture you want to take at. So now this is all tied in with depth of field. Remember I said we'd talk about this in a minute, so I guess this is just a really good time to talk about depth of field also. If I want to take a picture of a scene, a big scene, then I want to have a big depth of field because I'm going to have, and what does depth of field mean? Depth of field is what's in focus from this point, front point of the table, to the back point of the table. I want everything in focus, so I need a large depth of field. That's depth of field. The distance it is from the front focus to the back focus. As we change our aperture, the bigger the number in the aperture readings, the bigger the number, like f11, f22, the more space we're going to have, the larger depth of field. Now, granted, that changes the different lenses that you have. And Kurt will be talking about that in the next session, so he'll tell you a little more on the depth of field and explain that even more. And as time goes on, we're going to show you examples in the upcoming features in some more sessions coming along the way. So look for that, if you will. Now, if I want to do something, we've talked about a big scenic thing, or I have a large group of people. Well, if you have 2 rows of people, you're going to have a little more depth. You're going to have one standing here and one back here. And so now, all of a sudden, you need this guy's face in focus as well as this guy's face. So we need a bigger depth of field. So you need to set the aperture at a higher number. Okay? Now, if I want to go in, and I like to take pictures of flowers, and I like to do close-up or macro photography. Maybe I want to come in real close on a flower and just get the anthers on the inside of the flower. And I want everything else to kind of go soft, and I don't want that in focus. Then I set it at a real short depth of field or a short aperture, which would be like, 3.5, 4.5. A smaller number gives me a shorter depth of field. And so only the stuff in between my hand is going to be in focus instead of this. So that means I have to focus in on just the specific thing. But what that does is it brings your eye to a central point. And once you can understand how that all works, you're going to be a much better photographer. So we've talked about shutter speed now, and shutter speed all plays in there too. Are you going to, where shutter speed really plays a part, if you want to put that as your priority thing, Say, for instance, you're going out to your children's athletic events. They're in school and they're in track. In springtime and they're in track and field and they're running. And you want to stop that movement. You're going to have a high shutter speed because the faster or the higher the number in the shutter speed, the more motion that it will stop. If you have a low shutter, in other words, if it goes click, all that motion is going to be blurred. Now, sometimes that's good for effects, but for the general public, that isn't too acceptable. You'll get a blurry picture. You know, sometimes you see people stand there and their hands are blurred and you get a ghosting image. That's what happens. They don't have a high enough shutter speed. If you're taking pictures, you're out for a nature hike and you see a waterfall or a stream and you want to stop the action on that water, then you have to set a higher shutter speed to stop the action. If you want it to look all creamy and milky in some of those pictures that you've seen coming over the rocks, then you set it at a slow shutter speed so it intentionally blurs it. So that's where your shutter speed comes into purpose. A lot of professionals you'll see use the manual setting. Manual setting is where you set both the aperture and the shutter speed. So you say to yourself, now wait a minute, how do you know as a photographer which is going to be the best, what those numbers should be? Well, inside there's a little meter and it's got little hash marks on it. Let me see if I can show you that, but you'll have a meter in here down at the bottom and you'll have little bars coming up. And so these bars, and then there's a central point that means it's the correct exposure. And when the bars light up on one side or the other, it means it's either overexposed or underexposed. So you want to head toward this middle spot. You want none of these bars to be showing. So in other words, if we have it like this, and the bar is right over this center point, then we have a good exposure. And that way we can be, a professional can determine a little more exactly what he wants, depth of field, how fast he wants to stop motion, things like that. So it's real important to kind of take a look at the manual settings. I think once you get used to this, and as you advance through your photography, you're going to be real excited about working with manual. Okay, now, if you notice on the back of a little point-and-shoot camera, in fact, maybe that's on some of the higher pro-consumer models, you'll notice that there's little mountains and there's little, you'll see people, there'll be symbols like this, there'll be a mountain. What do those mean anyway? It's just another type of setting. What the camera manufacturers have done is trying to make it easy for you folks out there in the field. They'll preset the camera to certain presets. And so if it's people, that means you're going to be taking portraits of people. So the tendency is it'll warm up the skin tones. It'll key more on the yellows and reds in the camera. In other words, it'll record those tones more. It will probably slow down a little bit and not have such a high shutter speed. Depth of field will be a little bit shorter because you don't need as much in the portrait because they're thinking of one person portrait. Now, if you go to the mountains, if you think about it, mountains, outside, outdoors, what colors do we see outdoors? A lot of green, don't we? Greens and blues. So they're going to key, the mountain symbol is going to have it preset more to the cool tones, which are the greens and the blues, to bring that out and enhance that. Depth of field is going to be longer in those presettings. I don't use those, but if you would like to do that, you can. Now there's some that'll have presets, show people and maybe a little star or something like that, and that'll be for nighttime. And it'll preset for you for night, so it'll open the aperture up wider. Remember, the size of the hole, it'll open that up wider so you can capture more. So you need to read your manual on that and find out what the different things are and go play with it. Give it a try and see what'll happen on it. I think basically that probably wraps up about everything on detail stuff, and you'll see more as we continue on now with our future sessions as to how all these things start coming together. And this is a tough concept, but if you can get the idea of the speed that opens and closes and how big it opens and closes, That's what you need to know. They all relate along with the ISO. Thanks for listening.